Welcome everyone to the second day of the Financial Statement Analysis Fraud Series. My name is Peter Easton. I teach a course at Mendoza on Financial Statement Analysis and Valuation. This series is a key part of that course. Thank you for taking part in the series. Having visitors like you to our university, even in this virtual setting, greatly enhances the experience of the students. The speakers welcome your questions, although there will be limited time to answer them. Please place your questions in the chat addressed to Laurie Marsh or myself. Excuse me. We will attempt to summarize the questions for the speaker. We may ask you to unmute yourself and ask your question live. Questions from students will be given priority because participation in the series is an integral part of the course. Our speaker today is Jacques, who is the Chief Accountant in the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Throughout his distinguished career, Matt has led teams of conducting complex forensic investigations in high-profile accounting, securities, anti-corruption, and other financial matters. Matt has several decades of experience as a public accountant, regulator, expert witness, and forensic accountant. He is a certified public accountant and certified fraud examiner. Prior to working at the SEC, Matt was a forensic accountant at Ernst & Young, where he was engaged by counsel to provide accounting expertise in investigations and litigation. He began his career in public accounting as an auditor at Arthur Andersen. Matt is a Notre Dame alumnus. After reading about the CARE fraud series, Matt called me one day and offered to help in any way that he could. And I quote, to make sure that he never sees a Notre Dame alum on the wrong side of his desk. We look forward to hearing from you, Matt. Over to you.
Hey, thank you. And thank you for that kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. As Professor Easton mentioned, my name is Matt Jacques, and I am the Chief Accountant for the Enforcement Division of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. Before I get started here today, let's see if I can do this on multiple screens. The views expressed today are my own and do not necessarily reflect those of the Commission, individual commissioners, or my colleagues on the staff of the Commission. Also, if I mention any particular action or cases, I am only referring to the allegations in the complaint or public order, and I am not implying that the facts have necessarily been proved or admitted. So thank you first to the University of Notre Dame and those responsible for this Fraud Day speaker series, and those for inviting me here to speak here today. Special thanks to Laurie Marsh, Professor Easton, Andy Richmond, all the other speakers, and everyone else behind the scene who made this program possible. It's an amazingly important topic and one that they do an excellent job of presenting on each year, so thank you. And also, this is where I now demonstrate my know your audience skills. I recognize we have a number of people here from the world of academics, students, most importantly, professors, wannabe professors like myself who dabble in lecturing occasionally. And from my experience, you all like to ask questions, usually questions I cannot answer given my current role at the SEC. However, I will still be happy to try and answer them. And so I look forward to those questions. As I go along here, please keep track of them. And then at the end here, I think we can have a good dialogue. But first, and this is part of me being an investigator, I want to ask a question of all of you. If you could maybe respond in the chat, I am curious, and let's maybe aim this at the students, but everyone's welcome to participate in this. Could you put into the chat, let's do your original major when you came into school, a slash, and then your current major, a hyphen, or let's do parens or something, and what you want to do now. So after you graduate college, what do you want to do now? So your original major, what your major is now, what you plan to do after college. And then let's add something, what you wanted to do for a career when you were 8 to 10 years old. So that's a lot. let's see if I can share my screen. Maybe I'll participate in this to help you all out here. Let's see, I got PowerPoint up over here. Let's share this, see this. So it might look something like this. So if you looked at the top one here, this would be me, engineering, accounting. I was going to be an auditor. I always wanted to be a firefighter, and we'll talk about that. The bottom one there, that is my 12-year-old daughter. If you ask her what she's going to major in college, what she's going to do, and what she wants to be right now. It'll change over time, I'm pretty sure. So I'm interested to see. Ooh, we got a lot coming in the chat here. Let's see what we got. Where's my chat? There we go. Accounting. Ooh, medicine. Work for the Big Four. Doctor. I like that. Pilot. Well, that's exciting. Oh, I'm definitely going to go through all these. Lawyer. Might still be in the cards. Entrepreneur. What is an entrepreneur? Farmer. Oh, that's fantastic. Baseball player. Architecture to accounting. Ooh, that's really interesting. Oh, it's Professor Beardsley. Oh, I should have known better. Anyways, thank you for that. I'm actually going to go through those a little bit later. And if you'll indulge me a moment, I'm actually going to now tell a little story about how I got into accounting and then ultimately forensic accounting. Look, as I put in my little sharing exercise here, I actually thought I was going to be a firefighter when I grew up. You know, my father was a firefighter. All his brothers were firefighters. And I have numerous other friends and family who are firefighters. And I distinctly remember one day early in high school, I want to say this was freshman or sophomore year, I informed my mother that I would not need to go to the upcoming college fair because I was going to be a firefighter like my dad and uncles. And my mother, I remember these words quite distinctly, she quickly informed me that my career would not involve anything that had me running into burning buildings because, and she said this, I do not have any more time in my day to worry or pray for firefighters. So I went to that college fair and I ended up applying to college. I never visited any colleges and I picked basically colleges with good sports teams, Syracuse, Boston College, Holy Cross, I was always fond of, Notre Dame. And I got into Notre Dame and my dad said, well, you'll go to Notre Dame. And I said, okay. And I decided I was going to be an engineering major. Why? Because my father thought I should be an engineering major. My mom agreed. And I still remember sophomore year in physics 201. And at the time, Notre Dame Stadium was undergoing its first renovation. And the dean of the engineering school was in there and effectively said, when you drive by the stadium and see the cranes, if you don't see vectors and think of torque, you are not going to be a good engineer. And when I drove by the stadium, I thought of touchdowns and tailgating. And so I actually left that class that day before it ended, went down to my career counselor. And I said, I'm not going to be an engineer, but I did well on the SAT and math. So maybe I'll be a math major, be an actuary. Seems like a good career. Well, come to find out, I'm not very good at math. And so for some, this is where it gets a little blurry for me, but by some chance, I ended up in some business courses. I ended up in an accounting courses, Professor Anthony Munoz's course. And it all made sense. And I learned in those first sort of introductory accounting courses that the secret to accounting is it's not about math. Accounting is about organizing economic events. It's about taking that information and forming it into a language, the language of business, the language that companies use to communicate to their investors, lenders, and others in the marketplace. And if it's done consistently and accurately, it's a language, that accounting is a language that allows those investors to understand company performance across time periods, across industries, across company sizes. And that all really made sense to me, finding the signal in the noise, organizing events. And that idea that financial statements and the accounting within those financial statements is a language is often the lens through which I think about our investigations into accounting and disclosure matters. Are companies truthfully communicating to investors the underlying economic transactions they are involved in? Are the financial statements that companies are providing their investors accurate, consistent, and fully disclosing material information? So I figured out I was going to be an accountant. This was great. And in 1999, as I left Notre Dame, I went to join one of the largest accounting firms in the world that had existed for, I think, over 100 years at that point, a place where I would become an auditor and have a good chance of ending my career there. And as Professor Easton had said, that place was Arthur Andersen. And so my career in auditing ended abruptly 4 years later in 2002. And from there, through a connection at Notre Dame, I got to join the firm Ernst & Young. And there, I went from auditing and joined what was known then as, I think, the Litigation Support and Investigations Group. And I remember the conversation with my good friend, Jed Donahue. He called and he said, hey, I heard you're looking for a job. You're going to get back into auditing. Where are you going to go? I said, I'm kind of looking for something different. He said, come be a forensic accountant. I said, well, what's that, Jed? And Jed said, I have no idea, but we get to travel a lot. I've been in Germany for 6 months. I said, that sounds exciting. And so I joined Ernst & Young and I became a forensic accountant. And for somebody who got into accounting because I like to organize information and translate those economic events into the financial statements and work with that, well, forensic accounting is that times many, many multiples. This is taking 50, 100, 1,000, million, a billion events, trying to find the signal in the noise. It's essentially doing a large puzzle when you know you'll never have all the pieces. And I really enjoyed my time at Ernst & Young doing that. The group I was in later became named, I think, the Forensic Investigations and Dispute Services. I don't know if it's still named that today. I think it might be. I'm sure the marketing people have found a reason to change the name multiple times. And then when I was at Ernst & Young, I got the opportunity in 2007 to interview what was and still is my dream job, staff accountant in the enforcement division of the Securities and Exchange Commission. This was a unique opportunity because the Boston office had an open forensic accounting staff accountant position. Very rare occurrence. I think they had 3 staff accountants or enforcement accountants at the time. I remember I had another friend who I'd worked with at Arthur Andersen. I bumped into him at, I think it was Gold's Gym at the time in South Boston. I think it was a Monday, chest day, obviously. And he said to me, Matt, they're going to be posting this position. You should get your resume ready. And I did. And I got in there and I was lucky enough to get a job there. And after 6 years at the SEC, again, my dream job, still the best job I've ever had. I went back over to the private side and I worked for a firm named Alex Partners where I got to do essentially what I did at the SEC, investigations. But this time I got to do them for companies in trouble, companies who knew they had a problem and wanted to find out the breadth and depth of it. I also got to help those same companies deal with litigation they were dealing with, or engage with regulators like the SEC or the Department of Justice or other agencies that thought they had committed a violation. Got to help them explain, be a translator of sort, to tell people, hey, this is what really happened. This is how it happened. To back that up with data, back that up with credibility, back that up with strong analysis. And then in 2018, my love of government service pulled me back again, and that led me to the SEC, Washington, D.C., where I got to do what I'm doing now, become the chief accountant of the enforcement division. So what does that mean? What is the SEC? Well, let's give a little background here. I think I can do this. Let's see if I can do this successfully. Oh, share that. Here we go. There we go. So the agency is headed by a 5-person presidentially appointed commission. These commissioners include a chairperson. The rule is no more than 3 commissioners can be of the same political party. Currently, our acting chair is Allison Lee. And many of you may have heard that Gary Gensler, down here in the lower left, currently of MIT and formerly of the CFTC, has been nominated to become the next chair. He's through the Senate Banking Committee and we're waiting on a vote on the Senate floor. Underneath those commissioners are approximately 4,500 professionals, attorneys, accountants, industry experts, and others. The agency has its home office in Washington, D.C., and then 11 regional offices spread geographically across the United States. And that may seem like a lot of people and offices until you realize the breadth of what the SEC has to regulate. You see what I put up here on the screen, 13,000 public companies, 12,000 investment advisors. This has 67 trillion under management. It's probably much greater than that now. I'm guessing it's closer to 90. 11,000 mutual funds. Again, 15 trillion is probably more than that under management. 4,000 broker deals, all these different entities. I want to say in 2020, there was about 100 trillion in trading activity the SEC was responsible for regulating. We get a little help though. The SEC also regulates certain self-regulatory organizations. Those of you going into auditing probably know of the PCAOB, the auditor's auditor, FINRA, who monitors trading activity, MSRB, in charge of the municipal markets, and SIPC, broker-dealers. So there's a little bit of leverage there, but it's a tough job. One of the most difficult things I do every day in my job is make resource allocation decisions. What are we going to do? What if we have indications that there's a fraud at a $50 billion company? And we have indications that there's the same type of fraud at a $2 million company. Well, that's a pretty easy decision, right? We'd probably want to allocate our resources to investigate the fraud at the $50 billion market cap company. But let's say it's more complicated than that. Let's say there's maybe indications of a minor violation at a larger company or a major fraud at a smaller company. How do we allocate our resources then? And those are the decisions myself and my colleagues make every day as we think about how we want to spend the most valuable thing we have, time of our employees, time of our colleagues at the SEC. How do we best deploy those people to monitor, regulate the securities markets, protect investors? Tough decisions. I like to think we do a really good job of it. Time will always sort of tell. And so the SEC's mission is threefold: protecting investors, that's where I specialize in being part of the enforcement division, facilitating capital formation, and maintaining fair, orderly, and efficient markets. And so in accomplishing that mission, there are multiple divisions and offices. We're not going to get into them all here today. The one where I work is the enforcement division, which focuses on investigating and enforcing violations of the securities laws. We're a civil agency. You're going to hear from other speakers who have worked for or are currently working for arms of the Department of Justice, criminal agencies. And they'll have typically far more interesting sort of tales of wiretaps and other movie-like episodes. However, we do work a lot with those other agencies. I work a fair amount with the Department of Justice, various AUSAs around the country, and the FBI, as well as other agencies. And while we do not have the ability to put people in jail because we are a civil agency, our remedies do include monetary relief, bars from participating in the industry. That can be an incredibly powerful tool, essentially saying, hey, you can't be an executive at a public company. You can't audit or be an attorney appearing or practicing before the commission, meaning you can't be one for a public company. It's essentially a career ender in a lot of ways. But one thing to remember is this too. The criminal agencies, those Department of Justice and others, they have different burden of proof than us. We all are familiar with from our regular TV shows, the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, right? I don't know what that translates to, 95+%, depending on who you talk to. Well, as a civil agency, we have to prove a preponderance of evidence that there's been a violation of the law. And what's that translate to? 51%. So there's a world between where the SEC polices and where the Department of Justice, FBI, and others police. It's sort of what I call policing the gray. And it's a really critical world, in my opinion. Our work in sort of that space, identifying violations of the securities laws that aren't going to put people in jail, but maybe fraud, maybe other violations that are incredibly important to making sure investors get the information they need accurately and consistently. I think that area where we do our work is the most important. And one of the reasons why we've been able to have such a successful financial reporting regime in the United States, the most successful financial reporting regime in the history of the world, quite frankly. And so within the SEC, that enforcement division where I do my work and my colleagues and I collaborate is made up of 1,500 professionals, primarily, again, of attorneys, accountants, industry specialists, and other supporting professionals. And my role as chief accountant of the enforcement division is to support and assist those investigative and enforcement efforts across a spectrum of cases, but with a focus on financial accounting, auditing, and disclosure matters. And not to create confusion, but there are 4 chief accountants. There's the enforcement division, myself, investment management, corporation finance, that's who reads all the filings that come in, the 10Ks and 10Qs that you've seen, and then the office of the chief accountant, which is a policy office. Don't worry though, we all get a gold calculator when we become chief accountant. It's incredibly powerful. I'll bring it out to Notre Dame sometime. It takes a lot of security to travel with, you can imagine. And so we have roughly 140 enforcement accountants in that structure spread across those 11 regional offices. Like I said, very rare opportunities to become an enforcement accountant. Average tenure at the SEC right now for our enforcement accountants is about 20 years. So to get those opportunities is rare. Most of our people who take these jobs, they keep them forever. And not because, economically that sort of makes sense, but the job itself is incredibly rewarding. Like I said, going back to sort of the fundamentals that got me into accounting, looking at a lot of data, working together as a team, sort of fighting against the odds essentially, right? 4,500, 1,500 in the enforcement division, all those investigations, digging through, getting to the solutions. Our people find that work incredibly rewarding. And the group we have, they come from varying backgrounds, including public accounting, forensic accounting, and other government agencies. We've actually, I was preparing for this, I remember that we actually have someone from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. And now that I say that out loud, I'm wondering how we hired him. But I kid, we're actually going to have, I think one of the speakers may have had a short stint there. One of our top forensic accountants. Again, it doesn't take sort of training in this field to be good at investigating. It takes a curious mind, it takes a lot of grit, and it takes a desire to figure out what happened. So we have folks from corporations that prepared financial statements. We have accountants with accounting degrees. We have attorneys with attorney degrees in our accountant group. It's really an experienced group, wonderful to work with. The diversity of our backgrounds is something I think that really makes us powerful. And the work we do as enforcement accountants can range from a number of different things. There's the classic accounting and auditor cases, typically involving financial statements of publicly traded companies. And this is the majority of where our accounting team spends their time. There's also FCPA matters, which for those of you not familiar, is the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, an act that, among other things, prohibits US companies and firms and individuals from offering or paying bribes to foreign officials to obtain or retain business. Our accountants' work in this space can include detailed analyses and review of sometimes hundreds of thousands of line items in a general ledger or other detailed accounting records, often in foreign languages. Prior to my time in the government, I've been all around the world conducting FCPA, as they're called, investigations. Incredibly exciting, sometimes a little dangerous work, going around figuring out where the money went. Were foreign officials given money or other assets in order to retain or obtain business? Insider trading, this is something you probably associate with the SEC quite directly. And our accountants assist there in everything from analyzing the trading gains and losses to sophisticated data analytics around phone and text records. How did information flow prior to a trade? You can imagine with all the activity going on today, we are incredibly busy in this space. Valuation matters. That's another area our accountants focus in, where our accountants utilize their expertise assessing the valuation process and look at the reasonableness of assumptions. Anyone paying attention these days to the SPAC activity? Well, the core of the SPAC business, acquiring a company for a certain price, is essentially a valuation question. So how are companies doing that? Are they making reasonable assumptions when they make those valuations? I'm sure some of you looked at the prices and said, well, that can't be right. We're asking those same questions. And others in this field will continue to ask those questions, particularly as this unwinds itself. The other area, and this is a big one, and I know one of the other speakers from the FBI is going to talk about this, asset tracing. And so this is really prevalent in the offering frauds and Ponzi schemes that we investigate. Many of you know from the headlines that the SEC regularly investigates situations where companies, mostly private companies, are raising money from investors. And during that raising process, there's a number of misstatements potentially made about how the money might be used. And so our forensic accountants play a really key role in the analysis to determine whether investor funds have been misappropriated. We're often challenged in a very short period of time to identify and trace large sums of money across hundreds of bank accounts, spanning years, legal entities, and jurisdictions. And I'll give you an example of that, and you're welcome to look this up. There's the case of Woodbridge Group of Companies, LLC. And so in our action, we've had multiple actions against Woodbridge and affiliated companies and an individual, Robert Shapiro, who's a former CEO. We allege that the Ponzi scheme was orchestrated through a web of shell companies that raised $1.2 billion from over 8,400 investors. And so we were able to obtain in there an asset freeze to prevent further dissipation of investor assets. And as a result of that asset freeze, successful bankruptcy litigation and our pursuit to recover those monies, investors are estimated to recover almost 50% of their invested funds. And so this analysis isn't really hard at its core. Follow the cash. Take my bank statement, compare it to Professor Easton's bank statement, compare to Professor Beardsley's bank statement, maybe look at some correspondence. That seems pretty easy. But think about that in the context of $1.2 billion across 8,400 investors. And recognize that every minute we lose in being able to trace, identify, and freeze those assets, which is an ability we have as an agency, means some of that money will be stolen. Money will not be recovered for investors. Might be used for nefarious reasons, might be switched to offshore accounts, might just be spent on a luxurious lifestyle, as we saw here in a number of ways. And so, again, you can imagine the complexity now of identifying and analyzing hundreds, sometimes thousands of bank statements and financial records in a short period of time. And with speed in there, it just becomes that much more important that we leverage, knowing that we don't have infinite resources, technology tools, expertise, the ability to make a judgment about where we want to focus our resources, and our ability as a government agency to demand records, testimony, and other information from entities and entities and individuals. In 2020, we filed a number of successful offering frauds, traditional ones involving straight cash raises, also a number of offering frauds involving cryptocurrencies or initial coin offerings, something you're all probably reading about, thinking about. Maybe some of you own some cryptos. I will warn you, and you can go on our websites, it is a space and a tool used by a number of fraudsters to get to investors that may not understand what they're putting their money into. Also, as you all probably know with Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, there's an anonymous nature to it. Well, you think that might be enticing to a fraudster to know that the sources, uses of that funding, of that crypto, of that currency are hard to detect, if not impossible? Something to keep in mind is if you do wade into this space, or as we see companies become more active in this space, including public companies, buying, transacting, utilizing cryptocurrencies. Not saying they're all bad, but certainly they have some aspects that should have you asking questions before you yourself deal in them. And sort of wrapping up what our accountants do, we have a lot of smart attorneys in the Division of Enforcement. And I've noticed that the smartest ones figured out a long time ago that having an accountant is probably the best way to get your case done efficiently and effectively. I know we'll be hearing, if you haven't heard from already, someone who is a forensic accountant or was a forensic accountant at the FBI. And I think what he'll tell you is he applies his skills across a whole host of activity, not just financial matters. And our smartest attorneys have figured that out as well. Our accountants are incredibly good at, again, capturing those economic events and translating them into something that is a language, right? Financial statements and analysis. That's a really powerful tool when you're looking to identify, investigate, and potentially bring action in a financial fraud. So now that we've gotten the SEC out of the way, let's talk about what's going on today. So I've been doing this for over 2 decades now. As I mentioned, I've been an auditor, a regulator, forensic accountant, now the chief accountant. And in my career, I have been lucky or unlucky to see, as I mentioned, my auditing days cut short by Arthur Andersen's demise, the crashing of Enron and the dot-com bubble bursting. I saw the subsequent enactment of Sarbanes-Oxley and really the significant changes that had on the worlds of accounting and auditing. I saw my first year as an enforcement accountant in the Boston office of the SEC. I saw it get off to a very active start because that was right in the heart in 2007, 8, and 9 of the financial crisis. I saw the subsequent enactment of the Dodd-Frank Act and the changes that had on financial institutions. And in my investigative life, primarily on the private side, I've led and participated in hundreds of investigations. I've done everything from worked on an oil tank farm in the Middle East to uncover a $100 million plus restatement accounting fraud. I've been to Moscow to investigate bribery schemes. I've been able to work with well-known public issuers in all of Asia, China, Tokyo, Japan, help them with issues ranging up to the $1 billion range. And so coming into 2020, I would have been comfortable to tell you I think I've seen it all. Nothing can surprise me anymore. And as usual, with any overconfident, statement, predictions about the future, I would have been incredibly wrong. And so we are now living in a pandemic world. And like many of you, we at the SEC and the Enforcement Division have been living and working through this current remote environment in what I describe as an evolving mode of operation. Early on, each day seemed to present an impossible problem to how we operate. And then the next day, someone would find a solution or workaround that either solved that problem or made it feel a little less impossible. And each week and month, I saw the investigative staff in our Enforcement Division get better and better at operating in this new normal. And look, that's not to say we have not had issues. Of course, this is not an ideal world to conduct investigations, take investigative testimony, or participate in a trial. But we are seeing less and less obstacles when it comes to how we operate, which is good. I would say we started out in March 2020 on a very downward trajectory for efficiency and effectiveness. We had a surprising run up in May, June, once we got used to the Zoom world. And we probably got up to about 80–85% of where we were before. It's really impossible to be in the investigative space and get back to 100% without being in person. And now we're sort of stuck there, and which is fine. I mean, I think it's more than acceptable. We've been able to do our job. I think some days we probably creep up above 100% or right around 100%. And I know coming out of this, now that we have these new tools, I think we're certainly going to be incredibly effective going forward if we can find a good way. And I'm optimistic we will to combine these tools and be able to operate sort of with the pandemic knowledge we have of how to do Zoom meetings, how to do things remotely, but also the benefits of being in person. And this is something I'm sort of interested in all of you students, and maybe you can throw something in the chat if you want to share. But how have your study habits changed? How do you do things different? Do you study more in your room? Do you look to get out of your room more? Are you doing more things online? Are you collaborating in where you might have gone to the study hall and hung out, or the library and talked through an issue? Are you getting on a Zoom with people? Or are you using the phone? If you want to share, I'd be interested to hear how your study habits have changed. Studying specifically. I'm also always interested in that. I wasn't a very good studier in college. So look, this ability to adapt to the pandemic conditions, it's particularly important for our enforcement divisions, financial accounting, and disclosure investigations, which I've said many times are some of the more challenging we undertake. And why is that? Well, it's really because of the sheer quantity of information, entities, and issues each of these matters typically touches on. I often do an exercise with the students when I lecture where I assign out different stakeholders in an investigation. Maybe someone's the CEO or CFO, there's employees, maybe some disgruntled employee or whistleblower. There's the auditors, investors, subsidiary management, people who aren't in the home office of the company, vendors, the board of directors, audit committees, lenders. And then there's the regulators, the SEC, the PCAOB, DOJ. By the time we get to the end of the exercise, usually everybody in a 50-person class has their own role, and they only represent sort of the entity. There are, in the real world, dozens, if not hundreds of people beneath them in some hierarchical structure. And so think about that. Think about all those names I just listed off, all those different entities, and then think about investigating a public company where all of those entities or people are stakeholders in that company. Think about the complexities. Where do you start? Who would you send a subpoena to first if you had to investigate a public company? Go ahead, throw something in the chat. Would you send it to the auditors first? Would you send it to the CEO first? The CFO first? Would you send it to the investors? Would you not send a subpoena? Would you do a bunch of research? I don't know. But I'm always really curious. I don't think there's a real answer to this. I've been doing this a lot of years. I have my own approaches. Yeah, but seriously, throw some stuff in the chat if you can get in there. That'd be great. Let's see. Anyways, so by the end of that exercise I do with the students, everyone's always a little bit overwhelmed to see just how many entities a single financial reporting issue at a public company can impact. It's really interesting. And despite the complexity of our investigations, our people have adapted, like I said. We've gotten back to close to where we were, certainly not at our best, but I'm optimistic as we emerge from this pandemic, we're going to be right back there, if not higher. And I'll be excited to see how we adjust to that. And I'm just incredibly proud of the exceptional work all of my colleagues have done, in the face of this. So early on in this crisis, in April 2020, and I'm going to gear this now towards accounting, The Office of the Chief Accountant, one of my colleagues, put out a public statement on the statement. It was called the Statement on the Importance of High Quality Financial Reporting in Light of the Significant Impacts of COVID-19. This guidance, I thought, was incredibly useful at the time, and as the situation has progressed, has become even more useful. Since that time, additional guidance has been released. And as an aside, if you haven't been there, I'd recommend everyone go to sec.gov and check out the website. We actually have a banner right up top that says SEC Coronavirus Response. It's really, really interesting to see all the different statements, all the different adjustments that the agency has made in light of financial reporting in a COVID world. It's something I'd recommend all of you read as you head out into internships and careers in accounting and finance. It's something that I think would give you a significant leg up on your peers as you go to Big Four accounting firms, in-house, or wherever you end up doing some of your work in the summers, to sort of think through and get sort of that macro level view of what's going on in the world of accounting, auditing, finance. Understand how a regulator like the SEC, which will most likely impact any job you take, has changed, how that has impacted those you're going to be working with, what they've been thinking about. Really easy read, lots of good links, pretty clear statements. I've been really proud of the agency's response to putting out information, which can be really important, just being transparent and sharing with the public, the users of financial statements. And importantly, in that statement, it listed some of the many accounting areas that may involve significant judgments and estimates in light of the evolving status of COVID-19. And that included, but we're not limited to, fair value, leases, debt modification, hedging, revenue recognition, lots of others. No real surprises in there. But one thing I wanted to focus on, and that's with regard to these areas, is the statement also noted certain judgments and estimates can be challenging in an environment of uncertainty. Well, that makes sense. Pretty simple. As we have stated for a number of years, the Office of the Chief Accountant has consistently not objected to well-reasoned judgments that entities have made, and we will continue to apply this perspective. And I think that part of the statement is an important one. It's an important one, not just for the current preparers of financial statements, but for all of you. We are well aware, and the regulators and the government and everybody's aware, that companies and individuals face difficult challenges, not just in the time of a pandemic, and that certain judgments have to be made. There can be two reasonable judgments made that are different within the accounting world. That's just a true fact. And while regulators are not in the business typically of second guessing well-reasoned accounting judgments, particularly those that are also well supported and appropriately documented, I will note that regulators, not just in pandemic times, but in all times, are always actively monitoring to make sure that companies are not taking advantage of their situation. So, and it's a situation like this, might be a good one to point to. Are companies nowadays using this pandemic to hide past mistakes? Are companies under pressure from the pandemic? You can imagine something that like a restaurant chain or some type of retailer that has been significantly impacted by the pandemic. What are they under pressures now that may cause them to do things that violate the laws? And we're thinking about that, and we will be thinking about that. And I want to digress a little on that, because one thing I think that, when I thought about Fraud Day and I saw what the other presenters were going to be talking about, it really circled me back to my first days at the SEC in the enforcement division as an accountant. It brought me back to one of my first cases. And I remember it was a restatement. I want to say it was a $20 million restatement. It was a revenue recognition, what ultimately was charged as a fraud. And I remember reading all the emails, reviewing the documents, getting ready for testimony. And during that time, I thought, this person must be terrible. This controller, the CFO who orchestrated this scheme, they must have been the most evil people in the financial world. They must have evil mustaches. They must have black top hats. They must cackle when they wake up in the morning. They must wring their hands as they were doing this fraud. And I got so worked up for testimony, and I wrote out this whole outline. And it was geared around this idea that these people must know that they were obviously going to commit fraud, and they intended to do so. And then I remember sitting in that first testimony and meeting that witness. And you know what? They looked a lot like me. They had an accounting degree. They had a family. They grew up in Massachusetts. They started their career in public accounting. And I found out that they didn't have an evil mustache or long-term devious plot to steal investor money. And that's not to say there aren't sociopaths out there, people who do intend to do this. But instead, these people, they were at a company that had significant financial pressure to succeed. The life of the company was essentially on the line. And they started pushing the limits of their revenue recognition policy with a few transactions that didn't violate the accounting rules, but it certainly stressed them or ran up against the rules. And then over time, those individuals, they started to engage in transactions that became more and more aggressive to the point that they did violate the accounting rules and the securities laws. But they were on a path they couldn't stop. They started borrowing from the future a little, and then they had to borrow a little more, because once you get on that wheel, it's almost impossible to get off without it crashing. And so that first case at the SEC, that first revenue recognition fraud I worked on, it taught me two really important things, two things that I hope you take away. First, most people who end up violating the law, they don't set out to do so, which should be a warning to all of us. And second, accounting, as I mentioned earlier, is the language of business. It's how we describe the underlying economic events that occur. And when the accounting stops describing that activity, it's a time to pause and reevaluate what's going on. And you're all going to be challenged with this at some point. You're all going to be sitting in a room. I know you're all going to be successful. You'll be successful auditors. You might become C-suite, CFOs, CEOs, controllers. You're going to be sitting in a room and someone's going to start talking about, well, if we structured the transaction this way, would that allow us to account for it that way? And that might be fine. And that might be within the bounds. But those are the beginning of essentially what leads to a lot of violations of securities law. That's the first step. When you start structuring the transaction to fit into the accounting in a way that helps you achieve an outcome, instead of stepping back and looking to say, look, what actually happened here in the world? What was the economic activity? Did we sell item A to company B? How much did we sell it for? Why are we doing these other shenanigans? Why are we making these other terms, baking them into the deal to allow us to account for this differently than if we'd just done this in the normal course? And that's when you should put your hand up. You don't have to say this is wrong, you're all fraudsters, but you could say, hey, we should talk to somebody about this. Maybe we should hire a consultant. Maybe we should consult our auditors. And you're going to be in a room where this happens, and maybe nothing will come of it. Maybe it will be fine. Or maybe it'll be something that pushes over the line, and maybe a regulator will catch hold of it. Maybe private litigation will ensue if the transaction goes bad. And I want you all to be there. To again, you don't have to stand up and point an accusing finger at everybody, but it would be nice if you asked to think a little harder about it. If you asked to talk to somebody who may be more familiar with this type of transaction. And I think if we all did that, if I knew at least all Notre Dame students were doing that, I would sleep a little better at night. I would love for all of you to put me out of business, to have no more frauds to investigate, to have no more violations of securities laws for me to chase down. I'm doubtful it's going to happen. Not everybody goes to Notre Dame and gets to go to Fraud Day, but hopefully you can spread the word to your colleagues and peers at other universities. So also back in early March 2020, our enforcement division thought hard about not only what was going on at the time, and there was a lot of fraud going on at the time. We have issued dozens of trading suspensions, and you can go on our website and see this, where companies, public companies, were touting the efficacy of their products to fight COVID. Who knew fraudsters might flock to an opportunity like, hey, we have some drug that's going to be a vaccine. This is pre when we actually had vaccines, remember. Everybody was starting to tout, hey, we can do X with our company. Hey, we are buying PPE. Hey, we are the leader in that. And come to find out, a lot of these companies didn't just have products that didn't do what they said. Some of them had no products at all. And so we employed one of our most effective tools in that space, which is a trading suspension. Allows us to freeze trading for a number of days and let investors know what you're buying into may not be what it claims to be. Really powerful tool. Also really devastating frauds. You can imagine the victims of those frauds are typically unsophisticated or, sort of unlucky investors, sometimes affiliated with the fraudsters through affinities, churches, other groups. It can be really sad to see the devastation that these frauds wreak. And so we were able to do a lot of work in that space. We were able to stop a lot of in that space, but we didn't stop there. We've continued to look again at how companies might be using this time to hide past mistakes, or if they're under pressure during this time, to engage in activity that may violate those securities laws and render their financial reporting inaccurate or inconsistent. And we're going to continue to stay in that space. It's something that I've been thinking a lot about. I don't have a lot of answers. We're learning more and more, but I'm a little nervous that we're not going to know everything until we come out of this and something happens. There's been a lot of stimulus money put into the economy. And so you can imagine that allows companies that are struggling or maybe engaging in bad behavior to at least weather the storm or have enough money to survive through it and not have to engage in activity. That would be great. Or continue to hide what might be a bigger problem. And one of the questions I'm asking is, what risks have been developing during this time? How have accounting systems changed? What if I used to have a meeting where Professor Easton, Professor Beardsley, Laurie Marsh, and I all got together once a week in person to go over a large construction project we were doing, and we broke out diagrams, and I was the accountant, and it was really nice for me to sit with an engineer or an architect like Professor Beardsley and hear what's going on and be able to determine if some of the accounting assumptions were accurate. But what if we're doing that over Zoom now? And what if we're not rolling out the blueprints? Or what if we're not chatting a little over a coffee before the meeting starts? Am I still getting all the information I need for our accounting assumptions to be accurate? How do you conduct an inventory? Any of you going into auditing will have the wonderful experience of on New Year's Eve, while all your friends are out at the club, you will be counting something, probably something horrible, in a warehouse somewhere to make sure that the company has as many or as little as they say they do. How are we doing that in a remote environment? Is there an opportunity for fraud there? Is there something we want to think about doing differently? How are auditors able to audit those inventories effectively if you can't see what's out there? It's a question I've been asking. And are these internal accounting controls that we've worked so hard to develop since Sarbanes-Oxley, and I think have been sort of the gold standard of financial reporting around the world, how are those operating? Have they changed in any way? Is there something we need to be doing different with those? And again, unfortunately, I don't know if we're going to know how this all changes or if anything's broken until we really emerge and we go back into the office and we see what's happened and we learn of things as companies do run out of money or businesses change. But I'm always interested to hear on this. And I'd be interested to hear from all of you if you want to give me some tips I can take back to the agency. How do you think accounting systems have changed? How do you think internal and control environments have changed? What would you be most worried about if you were me? Throw something in the chat. Or don't, we can talk about it later. All right, so I'm gonna end on one thing here. I'm gonna leave a lot of time for Q&A. I really wanna hear what you have to ask. I'm gonna talk about something, I'm gonna give you a little homework here. I'd love for you to go out and read, and it's the EPS initiative and the use of data analytics at the SEC. The EPS initiative, and EPS stands for earnings per share. I hope you all know that by now. It highlights our abilities to detect and investigate financial accounting matters using data analytics. It also gets to the heart about what this conference is about, how decisions in accounting in this case, ultimately grow to the point where they result in potential violations of the law. So in September 2020, the division announced the EPS initiative. We did this publicly for the first time. And it's a risk-based data analytics program that we designed that's focused on identifying and uncovering earnings management practices, both from an accounting and disclosure perspective. The program analyzes reporting companies in order to identify anomalous patterns in the reporting of quarterly EPS metrics, so earnings per share. And the way we built our model, it points out companies that suggest potential earnings management. In addition, we consider other risk factors, historical reporting patterns, other data points that indicate the issuer is an outlier as compared to industry peers or similarly sized companies. And the problematic practices that we identified through the aforementioned EPS initiative have some common characteristics. The accounting adjustments typically occur at quarter end when the company is not subject to year-end auditing. So those of you going into auditing will know or do know that the 3 quarters are reviews, which are far less rigorous than the year-end audit. We also learned that the impacted accounts are often discretionary and involve judgment in their determination, what I talked about earlier, judgments that we ultimately in these cases determined were not well supported or well documented. And also these adjustments or entries are highly material to meeting or beating consensus EPS. So it helped these companies meet or beat what the market was expecting, which is, you probably know, can be incredibly important to the performance of that company's stock price. We also know that absent this initiative, these types of improper accounting and disclosure violations are incredibly difficult to detect. And in September, we filed the Interface and Fulton Financial matters, which were the first cases to come out of this initiative, and this initiative is ongoing. I highly recommend you go to our website, sec.gov. You look at these cases, Interface and Fulton Financial. You read about these cases, and you take a moment and think about how they got to where they got to. In my opinion, this EPS initiative has been one of the most effective approaches that our division has ever taken to identifying accounting and disclosure fraud. And it's a type of fraud that I think is corrosive to the financial markets. It's incredibly hard to detect. Like I said, you can find those matters on our website. This is really the type of fraud that I got into financial investigations, forensic accounting to find. And I hope when you read the details, you'll appreciate why that's the case. And we expect from these initiatives and these cases that it's going to have an important impact. We hope a deterrent impact on companies, C-suite executives, those who prepare financial statements, those who conduct audits of both quarterly and year-end financial statements, and really to encourage everyone in the financial reporting process to pay a lot closer attention to certain year-end, quarter-end adjustments. And another important takeaway from the initiative and these cases are that the division will continue to leverage our internal data analysis tools to identify misconduct, including evidence of earnings management and other accounting or disclosure improprieties. However, I do want to note one thing, and this is probably a word that gets thrown at you, or words that get thrown at you all the time: data analytics. I did notice that as the media covered our EPS initiative, I identified what I thought was a bit of a misconception, that the SEC using data and data analysis to identify potential securities laws violations was some type of new or novel thing. It's not a new thing. The SEC and the Enforcement Division have long been in the business of using data to identify potential issues. And when we talk about data analytics, I think there's a tendency for people's minds to drift to the world of science fiction, movies where the big computer machine is spitting out the answer to predict the future. And while we have certainly advanced in the computational abilities we have available, I think we all know that just looking at our iPhones. I mean, these are still just tools that our people use. The success of any initiative at the SEC, or really anywhere, is really based on the expertise and the grit our people have. The ability of our people to just come up with the idea, right? Hypothesize the potential violation, identify the relevant data sets, obtain those data sets, clean the data. Any of you who have worked in data know 90% of the work is in cleaning the data, structuring it. Doing the analysis, that's actually a small part. That's pretty fun. That's just applying your ideas once your data set is clean and easy to use. But then we also have to do an investigation and maybe action on those findings from our data analysis. And that can take an investigation. And our investigations, as I mentioned earlier, are incredibly complicated. They take on average 2 to 3 years from opening to completion. There's a great quote from Craig Venter, he's a well-known biotechnologist. He says, "Good ideas are a dime a dozen for a smart person. What distinguishes good from great is how an idea is executed, how it becomes reality." And I think we saw that with our EPS initiative and my colleagues who thought that idea up, but then executed on it, really put their time, effort, energy into this to make this possible. Now we have a tool that we will use in perpetuity at the SEC to identify these types of violations. And look, on data analytics, I'm still trying to figure out what it all means myself. I mean, I have a pretty good idea considering it's part of my trade. You hear words thrown around. I think most people who throw these things around, they say, just do some data analytics on it, get some big data, may not have a true appreciation for what it is. And you have a major advantage being in school here today. People are going to be demanding this of everyone in the finance and accounting world going forward. Your friends or your former sort of classmates or alumni, fellow alumni who graduated 3, 4, 5 years ago, they don't have this advantage you have now. You know this is on the horizon. Data science is going to be a part of finance, accounting, auditing in a major way. Take advantage of that now. When you have to use those extra credits to fill your 150-hour requirement to become a CPA, or you're thinking about taking an extra course, throw your hat into the data analytics, data science world. Get in there. It is incredibly important. It is going to be the differentiator between you having a good career and a great career. It may be the differentiator from you making a fair amount of money to a tremendous amount of money. You're on the cusp of this. You've got the opportunity to invest in this. I would invest, if I could go back, this would be the #1 thing I would invest in. And in a big way. I would really commit to it if you can. And I'm not talking about learning R or Tableau or a couple things. I'm talking about understanding data science, understanding potentially programming, understanding how systems work, how to gather that data, analyze that data, how to apply statistics appropriately to it. All these things can be the difference in your careers right now. It's going to be the foundation for how you operate out there. It's going to be like typing or using the internet. And so with that, I am going to pause again here. And we are, what are we at here? The hour mark. That's about as long as anybody should ever talk at you. If somebody tries to talk at you longer than that, you should question why you were in the room. So there's my little data pitch. The CPA knows it as well. They have gone out, the NASBA and the AICPA has essentially said, look, our CPA is going to evolve. It's going to change. And you're either going to evolve with us or you're going to be left behind. I wouldn't be surprised if in less than 5 years, there's going to be database questions on the CPA exam, if not sooner. This is proof of purchase that I went to Notre Dame. You may have all partook in the marshmallow throwing. Well, back in the late 90s, we threw aquatic creatures. That is an octopus. You'll see the very handsome man in a Mass Pike t-shirt over here. That is me, next to my friend Roberto, as well as many other friends. Let's just say we sat on our hands the last 2 games our senior year after this octopus made its appearance at Notre Dame Stadium. The entire senior section got in a bit of trouble, let's say. These are my lovely ladies. They always make an appearance in my presentations. Incredibly proud of them. This is Grace, who will be a dancer, she has told me. I'm not sure what the other 2 want to do yet. They haven't decided. So we've now reached the Q&A portion of the presentation. So what do we have?
Okay, your first question is, we frequently learn about the fraud triangle as a tool for understanding fraud. Is this something you use in your job? And if so, how do you apply it?
That sounds like a question I set up for myself. So I get laughed at by my colleagues, but when we have a new issue emerging, let's say it's ESG disclosures, environmental social government, or SPACs, I actually sit down and I write out the fraud triangle and how that issue may hit at each one of those. So I look at the opportunity, and I write it out. I say, well, what's the opportunity for fraud here? Well, there might not be a lot of disclosure about something like this, or auditors may not be up to speed on it. I look at the pressures. What are the pressures here? Well, there might be some, because of COVID, people might be under more pressure to raise money. And I go through that and I actually write those out, which is, I think, the place you should always start. I think a lot of my colleagues sort of blow by it and they sort of jump into a case. And sometimes they forget that everything is rooted in that fraud triangle. Great question.
Sorry, I was on mute. Next question is, do most of the cases you investigate come to you from a third party or an outside source, or is it from inside the SEC while analysts are investigating the companies? And what type of subtleties do you pick up on as a red flag when you are investigating? And when do you determine that further investigation is needed?
Great question. So the sources of our cases, and I get this question all the time. Number one is actually self-reports. So a company comes to us, or an entity comes to us and says, hey, we found a problem. And they do that because we offer cooperation. If you self-report your issue and you show you've remediated, maybe you've fired individuals, you've thoroughly investigated it, in certain cases, you can avoid any penalty. You can avoid potential sanctions or fraud charges. It can be really powerful for a company to cooperate. Now, the cooperation has to be sincere and it has to advance our investigation. But that's a very powerful tool for a company to use. The other big source is tips, complaints, and referrals. And we have a whistleblower program at the SEC. If somebody submits new and original information and we ultimately end up charging a company or individual and the fine's over $1 million, that whistleblower, if they qualify, and there's a number of other requirements, is entitled to 10 to 30% of any monetary relief we obtain. So let me put that in perspective. First, all our whistleblowers are anonymous, so you can't associate them with any case. But we charged Wells Fargo recently, and they paid a penalty of $500 million for their financial reporting that was impacted by their creation of millions of fake accounts. So if you can do the math to take 10 to 30% of 500 million, you can figure out how lucrative it may be for a whistleblower. Now, the life of the whistleblower is very difficult. I mean, I talked about earlier, what to do maybe if you're in a room where people are headed down a bad path. Well, what if it gets so bad that you have to go to a government agency to report an issue? And we get a lot of whistleblower complaints every year, thousands. Not all of them pan out. Not all of them are right. And in that process, a whistleblower can really take on a lot of risk to their career, their own safety. So it's a tough path. It's not an easy one. And then I would say, sort of down the road there, we get referrals from other agencies, but down the road, I would say the proactive efforts, probably the smallest. If you had to identify, percentage-wise, I did the math a year ago. I want to say it's a fraction of the others. However, those are also some of the most important cases we bring, where someone's not self-reporting, where there isn't a tipster. And when we do identify through our data analytics or other analysis out there, through the red flags we look at, I mean, those can be some of the most problematic issues that we uncover. Great question.
Okay, my next question is, given the judgments required in setting loan loss reserves, especially during the pandemic, how can you realistically judge if a choice was fair at the time versus using hindsight? This can apply to warranty reserves and other similar judgments that require a single measure for an uncertain estimate.
Great question. And that goes back to the point I made earlier. Look, I try not to be in the business. I mean, there's hindsight bias in everything. And so I try not to be in the business of second guessing well-reasoned judgments. However, if I come across a judgment that is not documented at the time, is not well supported, happens to get to an answer that's convenient or helpful to an individual or company, that's something where we start to dig in. And usually when we start looking at emails, text messages, taking testimonies, other documents around it, we start to learn what the real genesis of that judgment was. And so if you're making these judgments at some point in your career, remember that. Make sure it's well supported. Make sure it's consistent with how you've made that judgment in the past, or the company's made that judgment in the past. Make sure it's well documented. Make sure it's been consulted. You've consulted with auditors or other experts in the area. And if you do all those things, even if the judgment is ultimately wrong, you will have insulated yourself from potential violations of securities laws most of the time. Again, it has to be done appropriately, it has to be well supported. But that's something that I think I wish people would do better, particularly in the accounting and auditing space. Better documented judgments, but also better supported judgments. Great question.
Okay, the next one comes from Magdalena, and she's going to ask it.
Hi, Matt. Thank you for coming out today. What do you think we as future auditors should do to make sure that our clients are presenting their economic events in the most accurate way possible? And what is the biggest threat to accurate financial reporting?
Yeah, so I think this is interesting. So if you probably see these fun graphics, right? Like, we created this much data up until 2010, and now every 5 days we create double that. We just the increase in information out there is incredible. right? Every day, all of you create gigabytes of information every day between your emails, text, sharing videos, all these things, right? And so the biggest challenge I see to financial reporting is going to be capturing that data, particularly for companies that trade in information, right? We have a whole sort of surveillance capitalistic market now, marketing and other things that essentially trade in information. So gathering, collecting, organizing that information in a sort of comprehensive, accurate way, consistent across time periods, I think is going to start to become a real challenge. This goes back to investing in yourself and data science. The regular things, making sure the accounts receivable are accurate. You'd think, well, that seems pretty easy. Well, wait a second. I just talked about cryptocurrencies. How are you going to audit cryptocurrencies? How are you going to audit cash if it's held in a cryptocurrency? Do any of you know right now where cryptocurrencies are classified on the balance sheet? If a company like Tesla, who bought 1.5 billion, or MicroStrategies and others out there who are buying cryptocurrency, do you even know where on the balance sheet those are classified? Well, it's for the most part intangible assets. Does that make sense? How does that work? And so really staying current, staying up to speed on data, understanding all this is going to be critical for everybody in the field. But that's the thing I sort of worry about most is, how are we going to capture this data? How are we going to control it? How are we going to analyze it? How does that impact the auditing profession? And how do these things like blockchain, cryptocurrencies, and digital assets, how do those impact the financial reporting process? Great question. Thank you, Magdalena.
Okay, next question comes from Kelly. Kelly, do you want to ask it?
Yes, good morning. First, I want to say thank you for coming out and talking to us this morning. And I wanted to ask, have you seen any changes in estimates by companies like over the past year?
Yeah, so let's just take the banking world, and you can all go do this. If you go back and see, at the beginning of the pandemic, they rightfully thought, hey, we've made loans to folks, probably not going to get the money back. And they put up what are called reserves, right? They said, hey, we're going to take an expense now and put up an accrual because we don't anticipate these loans being as profitable as we once thought. Well, they've actually started to reverse a lot of this. Things are actually looking better than they thought. And so we've certainly seen a number of changes in that space. And I expect to see even more as we get out of this sort of subsidized period where all the stimulus money comes out of the system, or at least flows through the system. So it's going to be a really interesting time to look back, sort of pre-pandemic, pandemic, post-pandemic, and to see exactly your question, how companies' estimates, and I think loan loss is a great sort of barometer within there for allowances for accounts receivable. Essentially, am I going to get paid by people who owe me money? And to see what happened to those estimates during that time. Thanks, Kelly. Great question.
And next question is, how important to your job is the recently passed AML law in the US requiring the identification of beneficial owners?
So my current job, we do a little in the AML space, not a lot. My prior life at Alex Partners and Ernst & Young, we did a lot of money, we did do a lot of money. We did a lot of business supporting companies, making sure that their anti-money laundering controls were in place, as well as investigations, monitorships, and other things in that space. That falls more into the treasury world. And it's one that I am really interested to see how it plays out, what this does. One thing I'm always sort of skeptical of is people pass these laws and they say, this is going to stop the fraud. Well, water finds the crack. And so usually when we plug one hole, another opens. So I'm very interested to see which hole opens in the anti-money laundering space going forward.
Okay, Philippe, can you ask your SPAC question, please?
Yeah, give me a sec. I just need to scroll up to find it now. But yeah, so hey, Matt, thanks for coming out first off. So regarding the SPACs that you mentioned, you said how it really boils down to a valuation matter. So then I was wondering, what does it suggest if a SPAC is overpaying substantially for a firm, and what is the potential criminal or civil infraction there exactly?
Yeah, so in all our cases, the violation usually gets down to have companies accurately represented information to investors. So whether that be through the financial statements, right? Have they accurately told their revenues, or disclosures? So in the SPAC space, you can imagine disclosures are of particular interest. interest, right? What went into that valuation? Who was involved? Did a company violate the law by omitting certain disclosures? Maybe they made an acquisition, and I'm just saying this all hypothetically. Maybe they made an acquisition without disclosing that they were a related party to that acquisition, hence the inflated valuation. And so those are really the core foundations of all of our cases. And then you just sort of apply those up, right? You go to your fraud triangle, and then you start thinking through in the SPAC space what that means. Well, there's a lot of relationships in there, right? How are those disclosed? Are they disclosed accurately? When the target was announced, was that timely? Was it fully disclosed once they knew they were going to do that acquisition? If there were certain factors or assumptions that went into that valuation, were those disclosed? Were they accurate? And those are the questions we ask and sort of build up. No two cases, or well, handfuls maybe, buckets may be the same, but very rarely are the cases sort of similar to others. There's always sort of a bit of a facts and circumstances element to all of them. And I expect to see that if we do end up bringing action in the SPAC space. Great question, Philippe. Thank you.
Okay, next one is, could you discuss GAAP and non-GAAP EPS and which or both you're most concerned about and why?
So the foundation of our financial reporting system is GAAP, right? That's what is audited by the auditors, the financial statements. That's where the internal controls over financial reporting are. Non-GAAP, right? It is a derivation of the GAAP financial statements. Now, non-GAAP isn't necessarily audited by the auditors. Non-GAAP starts to take, sometimes at least, management judgment into what should be included or not included in those estimates to determine what the non-GAAP figures are. If you look at adjusted EBITDA for one company, it's probably different from adjusted EBITDA from another company. And so when we get into non-GAAP, it's not that it's bad. It actually makes sense in a lot of industries. It makes sense for companies to report information that their investors find useful. And maybe because GAAP is sort of one size fits all in a lot of ways, company in industry A might want to report some non-GAAP metrics because they're different than company in industry B. Where the questions arise is, are those non-GAAP figures comparable? Are they accurate? Are they consistent? Right? And that's where I start to get a little concerned. And I have no problems with companies using non-GAAP metrics if they are accurate, fully disclosed, and consistent across periods. And that's something I think 90 plus, 96+%, I forget the last number of the Fortune 500 or maybe the top 1,000 companies use some type of non-GAAP metric. We're going to continue to see them. We're going to continue to look at them as an agency. And I think companies, are sort of best suited to make sure they're asking their own questions about, do we have the right internal controls around these non-GAAP metrics, and are we thinking about them, correctly?
Okay, our next question comes from Eric Burley. Eric.
Yep. Hey, Matt, I have a quick question. It's a little more of a political question, but I'm still interested to hear your opinion on it. Do you think that prohibiting companies from paying bribes to foreign companies hurts U.S. companies, whereas some countries might not care if their companies do?
So number one rule, Eric, of being a government official is never answer political questions. So this is me dodging you. It's nice to meet you. I like your beautiful picture behind you. Looks wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
That was a good time. Look, I think corruption, and just sort of generally, and not to dodge your question, I think corruption and violations of the law are wrong in sort of all aspects. It's foundational to me. I think if you look at the damage that corruption in any way causes, not just to the companies involved, but the individuals who live in places where corruption is prevalent, is just something as good corporate citizens, we should not tolerate.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, next question is, you seem to be suggesting that earnings management is fraud, but pushing the boundaries of GAAP may be legal even though unethical.
Yep. No, I think that's right. I think channel stuffing is a word that comes up where companies sell a lot more at the end of a quarter. Doesn't mean it's a violation of GAAP. Doesn't mean it's a violation of the law. But what I will say is, and if you read the cases we brought, underlying the issues we saw with the earnings management, the EPS initiative, were violations of GAAP, were violations of the law. But I expect companies to try and do the best they can within the bounds. The EPS initiative, looked at a lot of companies and found that a number of them, while aggressive or within the while aggressive, were within the rules and did not violate the securities laws. But others, stepped across that line. I think it's important to remember that if you are up against that, if you are aggressive in your accounting, you should be very conscious that you haven't stepped over that line.
Okay, Audrey, your question's next.
Hi, Eric. My question is, since becoming an employee at the SEC, has your understanding of audit or really your opinion towards the big US accounting firms changed? And if so, how?
Yeah, not really. I mean, I've worked at big accounting firms. I certainly enjoyed my time there. I think they're wonderful places to learn and train. I think they serve an important role. As somebody who regulates all auditing firms in a way, or at least is exposed to them in certain ways, I see sometimes the downside of some of the firms, and I see sort of some of the worst behavior that their employees, unfortunately, stumble into or engage in. And so I try to make sure to really, remember that that's just a small piece of what are very large firms that for the vast majority of cases do an excellent job, auditing and helping our financial reporting process.
Okay, your next question comes from Manuel. Manuel?
Yes, hi. So my question has to do more with like data analytics. My background, I was an econ major with a minor in basically computer science. And I'll be doing like fraud investigations and data analytics at FTI Consulting. And so my question is more, I guess, what sort of new data analytics or data science techniques will be used by you and your team in the future, especially as the availability of big data becomes more prevalent, but at the same time, it becomes more difficult to analyze large amounts of data?
Yeah, so I don't have like a special tool, I'd say, but what I'm sort of always going for is, how do we get closer to the data and how do we remove sort of interfaces? One of the things I've observed is that particularly at large public companies or large entities, there's all these sort of interfaces. Like, okay, we report in Oracle at the home office, but we have these subsidiaries we bought that report in SAP. And sort of normalizing that data to get it faster and harmonious, essentially, I think is going to be the key. And tools that can do that quickly and sort of cut through all the what I'll call data bureaucracy you have to deal with in a lot of institutions. I think that's what we're going to see things move to. And unfortunately, right, so where's the money at? Well, the money is at Oracle and SAP. They want to create gateways. They want to sort of capture information in that way, right? So getting down to the underlying true content is really challenging. And I think as we get better and better in this field, the ability to do that and do that quickly is going to be what differentiates, the good from the great.
Great, thank you.
So I wanted to take the
Laurie. Sorry, I have one policy. I always end early. So,
well, we have 2 minutes, and so I want you to wrap up with this. It's kind of a two-part question, asking what skills they should learn in public accounting that would help transition to forensic accounting later. Is there any specific certification that's required? And based on your experiences with Andersen, what is your last and final tip for overcoming challenges early in your career?
Oh, that's a good question. Oh, that's like a sad one. Okay, so in auditing at the Big Four, look, it's an amazing training ground. You're going to work a ton, make friends, work on your network, really invest in learning about people, invest in learning about the companies you're going to audit or do tax returns for. Really spend time thinking about what they do, not just what your job is in front of you, but what do these companies do, right? Help your brain translate those financial statements all the way down to the underlying economic events. If you can do that and network and really build relationships, and I'm not talking sort of, I'm friends with them on LinkedIn, but really meaningful relationships, that's the best thing you can do. And I'm going to transition that into that. That's what sort of helped me in my career, even with some of the early challenges and having to sort of get displaced from Arthur Andersen. I was really lucky in that, through happenstance, not intentionally, I had built a lot of strong relationships. Somebody who from Notre Dame, welcomed me into Ernst & Young and got me in there. somebody I met at Gold's Gym, or saw at Gold's Gym that I had become friends with at Anderson to help me get in the SEC. All these little relationships, those aren't the only two people I know. I'm lucky to know thousands of people through the work I've done. But making sure those relationships are meaningful and really cutting ties with the people who aren't nice and focusing on the people who you do, really riff with and really do, share a common belief system. That can be so powerful in your career and probably the most important thing. Good end question, Laurie. Thank you.
Well, it wasn't me. Okay, Peter, do you have any final words? I muted him earlier, so I don't know if we'll get him back or not. All right. Well, since we're not going to get him back, everybody, thank you for attending today. Matt, thank you so much. They're going to get their reviews to me in the next couple of hours, hopefully in the next 24, and then I will get everything over to you for any additional questions that they want to complete. And thanks so much for taking your time to speak.
No, thank you to all of you. Everybody be safe, enjoy yourselves, and hopefully we will see you in person at some point. Take care.